In the bustling chaos of the high school hallways, she was a ghost. Not a spooky, see-through kind, but the kind of person that eyes just seemed to slide past. She was a quiet girl, with hair that was always tied back in a simple way, and clothes that were chosen for comfort, not for attention. As the bell shrieked, signaling the end of another class, a river of students surged around her, a loud laughing, shouting current that flowed on either side, leaving her standing like a smooth gray stone in the middle of a stream. She didn't mind it, not really. It was easier this way. To be unnoticed was to be left alone. And being left alone was the one thing she truly wanted. Her feet knew the path without her thinking. She turned away from the crowded main corridor, her worn sneakers making almost no sound on the linoleum floor. The noise faded behind her as she walked down a narrower, less used hallway. This was the back way to the auditorium, a place most students only visited for assemblies or when they were forced to watch a school play. For her, it was a sanctuary. The heavy double doors were usually propped open with a rubber doorstop, inviting a sliver of dusty light into the dim hall. She slipped inside, and the world changed. The air in the auditorium was different. It was still and cool, carrying the faint, sweet smell of old velvet from the seats and the woody scent of the stage itself. The vast, empty room was a shadowy cave, with only the emergency exit signs casting a faint green glow. It was here, in this quiet kingdom, that she was not a ghost. Here she had a voice. Her eyes found it immediately in the corner of the stage. Bathed in a single beam of dusty light from a high window, the old upright piano, it was not a beautiful instrument. Its wood was scuffed and scratched in 100 places, a map of its long life. One of the black keys had a small chip near the front, and if you pressed the very highest C just right, it would sometimes stick, needing a gentle nudge to come back up. But to her, it was perfect. It was a friend. She ran her hand lightly over its lid, feeling the cool, smooth wood under her fingertips. This was where the noise of the school, the pressure of classes, the feeling of being invisible, all of it just melted away. She sat on the worn wooden bench, which creaked softly under her weight, a familiar greeting. She didn't open any sheet music. There was none. Everything she knew, she had learned by listening, by closing her eyes and letting her fingers find the patterns on the keys. Her hands, which seemed so awkward and fumbling when she had to give a presentation in class, became confident and sure here. She rested them on the cool ivory for a moment, just breathing. Then she began to play. It started softly, a simple melody that felt like a question. The notes were a little hesitant at first, as if she were waking the piano from a long sleep. The sound wasn't perfect. The middle B was always a little flat, and the strings had a faint buzz that you could hear if you listened for it. But she didn't listen for the flaws. She listened for the feeling. As her fingers began to move more freely, the simple melody grew. It was a piece she had heard in a movie once, a sad, beautiful tune that had stuck in her head for days. She had spent weeks trying to figure it out, hunting for the right notes on the keyboard until the song was hers. The music filled the empty auditorium, soft and searching. It wasn't the loud, confident music you would hear from the band room. This was a private conversation. Each note was a word, each phrase, a sentence. The music was her telling the piano about her day, about the loneliness of the lunchroom, about the way her heart felt heavy sometimes. And in return, the piano seemed to understand. Its vibrations humming up through the bench and into her bones, a comforting reply. She closed her eyes, her head tilting slightly to the side, and the world outside these four walls disappeared completely. There was only the feeling of the keys under her fingers and the sound of her own heart speaking through music. This was her secret, a hidden garden in the middle of a noisy concrete world. She never played when anyone else was around. The thought of it made her stomach clench. Her music was too personal, too much a part of her to share. It was like reading your diary out loud. So she kept it for these quiet moments, during her lunch break, or after the last bell had rung. When the school was empty and the shadows grew long across the stage, her music teacher, a stern man with a face that seemed to be permanently set in a disappointed line, would not have understood. He was a man who lived and breathed technical perfection. His classroom was a world of sharp, precise sounds. He would stand with his arms crossed, his glasses perched on the end of his nose, and critique a student's performance with the cold accuracy of a surgeon. Your crescendo was a fraction of a beat too early, he would say. Your fingering on the arpeggio was sloppy again, with precision. He adored his star students, the ones who could play complicated classical pieces flawlessly, their fingers flying across the keys like machines. He would praise them, a rare, thin smile touching his lips, and say, "Now that is music. Discipline. Control." He had heard her playing once. She had lost track of time, and the door to the auditorium had creaked open. She stopped instantly, her hands freezing on the keys as if they had been burned. He stood there for a moment, silhouetted in the doorway. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at her, then at the old piano. She felt her face grow hot with shame. "Just plinking away, are we?" he had said, his voice flat and devoid of curiosity. It wasn't an angry question, but it was worse. It was a casual dismissal, like swatting a fly. He waved a hand in her direction, a gesture of complete indifference, and then turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. The word plinking had stuck with her, sharp and painful. It made her feel small and foolish. For a few days after that, she couldn't bring herself to play. But the silence in her life was deafening. The auditorium felt empty without the music. Slowly, she had returned to it, her playing a little more timid at first. But as the music filled the space again, she started to feel something else. A quiet defiance. It didn't matter what he thought. This music was not for him. It was not for a grade or for applause. It was for the quiet girl in the empty auditorium. It's the one who was finally learning that she had a voice, even if no one else was listening. And as she played, the music grew a little stronger, a little clearer, licked up, filling the dark room with a light that was all her own. The music classroom was the complete opposite of the auditorium. It was bright and loud, a square box filled with neat rows of chairs and metal music stands. The walls were plastered with posters of stern-looking composers and complicated charts of music, the theory that looked like some kind of secret code. The air always smelled of floor polish and a faint, sharp scent of old paper from the sheet music stacked in the corner. This was the teacher's kingdom, a place of rules and right answers, and she always felt like an intruder. She would choose a seat in the very back by the window and try to become part of the wall. She kept her head down, her notebook open. But her thoughts were often far away, drifting back to the dusty, quiet stage and the feel of the piano keys under her fingers. The teacher stood at the front, a man whose posture was as rigid and precise as the music he adored. He was talking about the upcoming winter showcase, his voice sharp and clear, cutting through the low murmur of the class. He walked back and forth as he spoke, his polished shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor with every turn. He was agitated. You could see it in the tight set of his jaw and the way he kept tapping his fingers against his own arm. "The opening slot is the most important," he was saying, his eyes scanning the faces of his favorite students, the ones who sat in the front row. "It sets the tone for the entire evening. It needs to be powerful. It needs to be flawless." He stopped his pacing and sighed, a sound of pure frustration. "And now, with our best pianist out with the flu, I am left with a gap." He looked around the room, his gaze lingering on a few students who shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They were good, very good, but they weren't the one he wanted. They weren't perfect. He ran a hand through his neatly combed hair, messing it up slightly, which was a sign of how much this was bothering him. "We need something with gravitas," he continued, using a word that made a few of the students glance at each other with confused looks. "Something that commands respect from the first note. Not a simple folk song, not a pop tune rearranged for the piano. We need art." He said the word art, as if it were a heavy, sacred object. The room was quiet now. Everyone knew how much the showcase meant to him, how much he wanted their class to be the best. He started asking his top students, one by one, if they felt ready to take on such a big piece. Each one had a reason why they couldn't. One was already performing a difficult violin solo. Another was singing in the choir and couldn't do both. A third admitted, with a blush, that the piece was just too hard and they hadn't had enough time to prepare it perfectly. With each excuse, the teacher's face grew darker. He was a captain whose ship was springing a leak, and he didn't have a bucket. He let out an exasperated breath and leaned against his desk, looking defeated for a moment. It was in that brief silence that a voice spoke up from the middle of the room. It was a quiet voice. It had cut through the tension. "What about her?" a classmate asked. The girl didn't even look up at first, assuming they were talking about someone else. But then she felt a shift in the atmosphere, a sudden prickling sensation on the back of her neck. She slowly lifted her head and saw that the classmate was looking directly at her. "She plays the piano," the classmate added, a little less confidently now that everyone was looking. "I've heard her. She's really good." A few heads turned in her direction. A wave of heat washed over her, starting in her chest and rising to her face. She wanted to slide under her chair and disappear. Why did they have to say anything? The teacher pushed himself off his desk and turned to look at her. For a long moment, he just stared, his expression unreadable. Then, a short, sharp laugh escaped his lips. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was a cynical barking sound that made a few students jump. "Her," he said, his voice dripping with a kind of amused disbelief. He took a step towards her, his eyes locked on hers. "Oh, I am well aware of her." Musical activities. He walked slowly down the aisle between the desks, his steps deliberate and heavy. The class was silent, watching him. He stopped right beside her desk. She could smell the starch in his shirt. "I have heard her," he said, his voice lower now, but somehow even louder in the quiet room. "I have heard her plinking," said the word slowly, letting it hang in the air. "It is a pleasant enough noise, I suppose. Like a bird singing outside your window. You don't mind it, but you would never pay to hear it in a concert hall." A few students let out nervous giggles. The girl felt her cheeks burn with shame. She stared down at her notebook, at the meaningless doodles in the margin. Wishing she could erase herself from the room, to make his point, he leaned over her desk and, with his index finger, began to tap out a clumsy, childish tune on the hardwood, plink-plink-plink-plink. It was a ridiculous, simple sound, a mockery of everything she felt when she played. The giggles in the room grew a little louder. He was making her a joke, a public joke. "This is what we call noodling," he announced to the class, his finger still tapping out the insulting rhythm. "It lacks structure. It lacks discipline. It certainly lacks the technical precision required for a stage like the one in the auditorium." He finally stopped tapping and stood up straight. Looking down at her with a smirk, she felt a strange mix of emotions boiling inside her. There was the overwhelming shame, the desire to cry. But there was something else too. A tiny, hot spark of anger. He didn't know. He had never really listened. He had only heard what he wanted to hear, a confirmation of his own beliefs. He had no idea about the hours she had spent, the way the music felt like a part of her, the way it could make her feel everything and nothing all at once. He had turned her private world, her sanctuary, into a cheap joke. The teacher seemed to feed on the silence, on her humiliation. He enjoyed being the center of attention, the one with all the power. He looked around the room, making eye contact with the other students, as if to say, "You see? This is what I'm talking about." Then he turned back to her, his smirk widening. "But," he said, his voice taking on a false, generous tone, "I am an educator. I believe in learning opportunities. I believe in letting students see for themselves." He gestured with a grand, sweeping motion towards the polished black grand piano that sat in the corner of his classroom. It was a beautiful instrument, sleek and perfect, and it looked intimidating. "Unless you can prove me wrong," he said, his eyes gleaming with a challenge. "Unless you can get up there and show this class something that resembles actual music, I suggest we leave the performance to the serious musicians." He crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, waiting. The entire class was looking at her. Some with pity, some with curiosity, and some with the same cruel amusement as their teacher. The room felt incredibly small, the air thick and heavy. She was frozen in her seat, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The choice was his, not hers. He had backed her into a corner. Now the only way out was through the very thing she had always been afraid of, playing for an audience. For a long moment, the world was frozen. The teacher's challenge hung in the air, sharp and heavy like a guillotine. Every eye in the room was on her, a dozen tiny hot spotlights that made her skin prickle. She could feel her heart beating a frantic, trapped rhythm against her ribs. Her mind was a screaming mess of conflicting thoughts. Run. Just get up and run out of the door. Don't look back. But another voice, a quieter but stronger one, whispered back, "No, not this time." She thought of the old, scarred piano in the auditorium, her one true friend. She thought of the hours she had spent there, pouring all her loneliness and her secret hopes into its keys. He hadn't just mocked her. He had mocked that. He had tried to turn her sanctuary into a joke. With a movement that felt both slow and unreal, she pushed her chair back. The legs scraped against the linoleum, a loud, grating sound in the dead quiet of the room. She stood up, her legs feeling shaky, as if they might not hold her. She didn't look at anyone. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, on the scuffed tiles and the faint lines of wax that the janitor had left behind. Each step towards the piano at the front of the room felt like a mile. The distance between her desk and the bench had never seemed so vast. She could hear a small sound, a shuffled foot, a quickly drawn breath. She knew they were all watching her, the quiet girl from the back of the class. Walking towards her public execution, the teacher didn't move. He remained leaning against the wall, his arms still crossed over his chest. But his posture had changed. It was no longer just relaxed. It was predatory. He was enjoying this. He was savoring her humiliation, confident that he was about to make a powerful example of her. The polished black grand piano seemed to grow larger and more intimidating with every step she took. It wasn't her friend, the scuffed and comforting upright in the auditorium. This was a stranger, a cold and perfect machine that was waiting for her to fail. She reached the bench and hesitated for a second, her hand hovering over the smooth, dark wood. She sat down. The bench was cold and hard, unlike the worn wooden one she was used to. The piano keys in front of her were stark white and perfect black, unmarked and unblemished by time. Her hands felt clumsy and foreign as she placed them on the keys. She could feel the teacher's gaze on her, a physical pressure on the back of her neck. She could feel the collective anticipation of the class, a silent, hungry crowd waiting for a spectacle. She took a deep, shaky breath, trying to calm the storm inside her. She knew what they were expecting. They were expecting the plinking. They were waiting for the simple, hesitant tune that would prove the teacher right. And for a moment, that is exactly what she gave them. Her fingers, stiff with nerves, pressed down a few simple, disconnected notes. The sound was thin and uncertain, a child's random fumbling at the keys. It was exactly the clumsy, childish tune the teacher had mocked on her desk. A few snickers rippled through the room. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the teacher give a small, satisfied nod, as if to say, "I told you so." A wave of despair washed over her. He had one. This was a mistake. She was about to lift her hands and give up, to flee the room and never come back. But then something inside her snapped. It was a tiny, hot spark of anger that ignited into a flame. The memory of his smug face, the sound of his finger tapping her desk, the word plinking echoing in her head. No, this music was not for him. It was not for them. It was hers. She closed her eyes, shutting out the classroom, the teacher, the dozens of judging eyes. She blocked out the world and let herself fall back into the music, into the quiet. Dark sanctuary in her mind, where it was just her and the piano. And then she began to play. The change was so sudden, so absolute, that it felt like the air in the room had been sucked out. The hesitant, simple notes were gone, swallowed by a torrent of sound that was powerful and complex and breathtaking. Her fingers, which had seemed so stiff and clumsy a moment ago, were suddenly alive, flying across the keys with a speed and grace that seemed impossible. The piece she chose was one she knew by heart. A fiery and emotional storm of a song that she had practiced for months in the empty auditorium, It was a song of anger and sorrow, of struggle and of fierce, defiant hope. The music filled the small classroom, pressing against the walls and the ceiling. It was no longer a simple melody. It was a story. The notes cascaded like a waterfall, sometimes soft and flowing, sometimes crashing down with the force of a thunderclap. Her left hand pounded out a deep, rhythmic bass that you could feel in your chest, while her right hand danced and wept and soared on the high keys. She was no longer just sitting at a piano. She was conducting a storm. Her body swayed with the music, her head tilted back, her face a mask of intense emotion. She wasn't thinking about the notes anymore. She was feeling them. Every ounce of her loneliness, her frustration, her quiet defiance was pouring out of her and into the room. The snickers in the classroom died instantly. A boy who had been leaning back in his chair, a smirk on his face, sat up straight, his mouth falling open. A girl who had been doodling in her notebook dropped her pen, her eyes wide with awe. One by one, heads turned. The curious, pitying, and amused expressions were wiped away, replaced by a single, unified look of complete and utter shock. The room was utterly silent, the only sound the incredible, roaring music that was coming from the quiet girl in the back row. The teacher's reaction was the most dramatic of all. The smug, confident look had been wiped clean from his face, replaced by a pale, stark mask of disbelief. His arms uncrossed and fell to his sides. He pushed himself off the wall and took a half-step forward, his eyes fixed on her hands, which were a blur of motion. He was a man who believed in discipline and precision, in music that could be measured and perfected. But this was something else entirely. This was raw, untamed, and profoundly beautiful. It was technically brilliant, but it was more than that. It had a soul. He was not just hearing a performance. He was hearing a voice he had never bothered to listen to, a depth of talent he had blindly and cruelly insulted. He looked from her flying fingers to her face, and for the first time, he saw her, not as a quiet, unassuming student, but as a musician, a true artist. The music reached its peak, a crescendo of such power and emotion that it felt like the room might explode. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Her fingers came down on the final chord, sound that was so full and resonant that it seemed to hang in the air like a physical object. The vibration hummed through the piano, through the floor, up through the bench and into her bones. And then there was silence. It was a heavy, profound silence, thick with awe and disbelief. No one moved. No one spoke. The entire class was frozen, captivated, completely transformed by the 2 minutes of music they had just witnessed. She opened her eyes, her chest heaving, her own expression a mixture of shock and overwhelming emotion, and saw a room full of people who were seeing her for the very first time. The final chord hung in the air, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to have a life of its own. It didn't just fade away. It vibrated through the floorboards, up the legs of the chairs, and into the bones of everyone in the room. For the girl at the piano, it was the only thing she could feel. Her fingers were still pressed down on the keys, as if they were glued there. Her chest was heaving, each breath a ragged, desperate pull for air. Her heart was a wild drum against her ribs, a frantic echo of the music she had just unleashed. She had her eyes squeezed shut, afraid to open them, afraid to see the faces that were surely staring at her, waiting for the joke to end. But the silence that followed was not the silence of mockery. It was not the quiet, awkward pause before laughter. It was a heavy, thick, profound silence that was so full it felt like a physical presence. It was the silence of a room full of people who had just witnessed something impossible. The air itself seemed to have changed, charged with an energy that was both electric and sacred. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights on the ceiling, a sound she had never noticed before, was suddenly as loud as a roar. The world, which had disappeared just minutes ago, came rushing back, but it was a different world now. Slowly, hesitantly, she lifted her fingers from the keys. The small movement seemed to break a spell. She opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was the polished wood of the piano reflecting the light from the window in blurry streaks. Then she raised her gaze and looked out at the classroom. and what she saw made her own breath catch in her throat. No one was moving. It was as if a photographer had yelled freeze, and everyone had been locked in place. The boy who had been leaning back in his chair was now sitting bolt upright, his mouth slightly agape, his eyes wide with a look of pure disbelief. The girl who had been doodling was staring at her own notebook, her pen lying forgotten on the floor as if she couldn't comprehend what had just happened. A few students had their hands half raised, not to ask a question, but as if in a gesture of surrender or awe. They weren't looking at each other. They were all looking at her. But the look in their eyes was not one she had ever seen before. It wasn't pity or curiosity or cruelty. It was a look of sheer, unadulterated astonishment. Her eyes moved past them and found the teacher. He was the most changed of all. The rigid, confident man who had ruled the room with his sharp words and smug smiles was gone. In his place stood a figure who seemed to have shrunk, his posture slumped and defeated. His arms were no longer crossed in a display of power. They hung limply at his sides. His face, which had been a mask of cynical amusement, was now pale and open, a landscape of pure shock. His mouth was open just a little, and his eyes, which had been so quick to judge, were now wide with a dawning, painful understanding. He was looking at her, but he was seeing something else entirely. He was seeing the immense, towering mountain of his own mistake. He was a man who had built his entire career on the idea that he could recognize talent, and he had just publicly and brutally mocked one of the most gifted people he would ever meet. The realization was written all over his face, a slow, agonizing crumble of his own certainty. The silence stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. It was so complete that she could hear the soft tick-tock of the clock on the wall, a sound that was usually drowned out by the shuffling of papers and the low murmur of teenage chatter. She could hear the sound of her own breathing, loud and uneven, in her own ears. She felt a strange mix of emotions churning inside her. There was a flicker of pride, a tiny spark of satisfaction at seeing the shock on their faces, especially the teachers. But mostly, she felt incredibly exposed. She had taken the deepest, most private part of herself and laid it bare for a room full of strangers. She had shown them her soul, and now they were all staring at it, silent and unmoving. Then a sound broke the heavy quiet. It was a single, sharp clap. It came from the back of the room, from a quiet boy who rarely spoke in class. The sound was so loud in the silence that it made a few people jump. It was a hesitant clap at first, almost questioning, but then it came again, firmer this time. Clap. It was an act of courage, a single voice breaking the spell of awe. For a moment, nothing happened. The boy clapped once more, a little louder, and then another person joined in. A girl near the front, then another, and another. It started as a slow, scattered rhythm, a handful of people finding their voice. But then, something incredible happened. The scattered claps began to merge to find a common beat. The sound grew, building in speed and volume, until it was no longer just a few people clapping. It was a wave. It was an explosion of sound that erupted from the class, a thunderous, deafening roar of applause that was completely different from the polite, obligatory clapping that usually ended a student performance. This was raw, and it was real. It was a release of all the tension, all the shock, and all the awe that had been building in the room. It was the sound of 20 people who had been completely blown away and had no other way to express it. The sound washed over her, physical force that made her flinch. She had never been applauded like this before. She didn't know how to react. She felt a powerful urge to run, to hide from the sheer force of their attention. She ducked her head, her hair falling over her face, a thin shield against the storm of approval. Her hands were trembling in her lap. She wanted it to stop, and yet a part of her, a part she didn't even know existed, wanted to soak it in, to let it heal all the years of feeling invisible and small. Just as the applause reached its peak, a loud, jarring bell rang, signaling the end of the class. The mundane, familiar sound crashed into the extraordinary moment, shattering it like glass. The students jumped, startled out of their trance. The applause died down, replaced by the sudden, chaotic noise of chairs scraping and zippers being pulled and books being shoved into bags. But the energy in the room was still different. As the students got up to leave, they moved slowly, as if in a daze. They didn't rush for the door. They gathered their things with a strange, deliberate slowness, her eyes still flicking towards her as they moved. Some of them gave her small, shy smiles as they passed. Others just nodded, a gesture of newfound respect. No one said a word. What could they possibly say? They filed out of the room, a quiet, thoughtful procession, leaving her alone at the piano with the teacher. The room was empty now, but it felt more full than it ever had before. The air was still thick with the ghost of the music and the weight of what had just happened. She sat there, frozen, listening to the sound of their footsteps fading down the hall, knowing with absolute certainty that her life and the way people saw her had changed forever. The last student's footsteps faded away down the hall, leaving a silence that was even heavier than the one before. It was a thick, awkward silence, filled with everything that had been left unsaid. The girl sat frozen at the piano, her hands still resting in her lap. She was afraid to move, afraid to breathe. The room felt like a bubble, and she knew that as soon as she stood up, it would pop, and she would have to face the man who was still standing by the wall. She could feel his eyes on her, but she couldn't bring herself to look at him. She stared at the keys, at the reflections of the lights on the smooth white surfaces. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and feelings. She was still shaking from the adrenaline, from the raw emotion she had poured into the music. She was stunned by the applause, by the looks on her classmates' faces. But underneath it all was a deep, trembling fear of what would happen next. The teacher held all the power. He could make her life miserable. He could pretend this never happened, or worse, he could find a way to punish her for upstaging him. She heard a soft sound, a scuff of a shoe on the floor. He was moving. She braced herself, expecting a sharp word, a sarcastic comment, a final attempt to put her back in her place. But he didn't say anything. He walked slowly towards the piano, his steps heavy and uncertain. He stopped a few feet away, not looming over her, but standing at a distance, as if he were approaching a wild animal he had wrongly cornered. He began, then stopped. His voice, usually so sharp and clear, was rough and hesitant. He cleared his throat. I was wrong. The words were so quiet, so simple, yet they hit her with the force of a physical blow. She slowly lifted her head and looked at him. His face was a picture of humility. The smugness, the cynicism, the rigid certainty was all gone. In its place was a raw, undisguised vulnerability. He looked older, tired, and deeply ashamed. What you played, he continued, his gaze dropping to the piano keys, as if he couldn't bear to look her in the eye. It was not plinking. It was the most honest and powerful music I have ever heard in this classroom. He took a deep breath, and it seemed to take all of his strength. I am a teacher. My job is to see potential, to nurture it. And I failed. I failed completely. I saw a quiet girl and I made assumptions. I let my own arrogance blind me to the talent that was right in front of me. There is no excuse for what I said, for the way I treated you. I am truly, deeply sorry. The apology was so genuine, so full of pain that it disarmed her completely. She had expected anger or resentment, but not this. This was a man broken by his own mistake. She felt a strange pang of pity for him, which quickly faded as she remembered the sting of his mockery. She didn't say anything. She just watched him, waiting. He seemed to understand that she needed more than words. He straightened up, a flicker of the old teacher in his posture, but his eyes were still soft. The winter showcase, he said, his voice a little stronger now. The opening slot is yours, if you will have it. It is the least I can do. He paused, then added, but I would like to offer more than that. Your talent. It's raw. It's natural. But it needs to be shaped. You need to learn theory, technique, discipline. I can teach you. I want to teach you. Private lessons. After school. No cost. It would be my privilege. She stared at him, her mind trying to process this incredible turn of events. The man who had mocked her was now offering to be her mentor. It was absurd. It was terrifying. And it was the one thing she had secretly always wanted. She had taught herself everything she knew, hunting for notes by ear, feeling her way through the music. The idea of actually learning, of understanding the structure behind the feelings, was a dream she had never dared to speak aloud. She thought about the old piano in the auditorium, her secret sanctuary. She thought about the way the music felt like a part of her soul. She thought about the look of awe on her classmates' faces. This was her chance to share that part of herself, not just in a secret, hidden moment, but on a stage, in the light. She took a deep, steadying breath, the first one she had taken that felt truly her own since she had walked to the piano. "Okay," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was clear and firm. "I'll do it." A look of profound relief washed over the teacher's face. He nodded, a simple, respectful gesture. "Okay," he repeated. "Tomorrow, then, after school." The next few days were strange and wonderful. She was no longer a ghost in the hallways. As she walked to her classes, people would look at her, but not with pity or indifference. They would smile or nod or whisper to their friends as she passed. It wasn't that she suddenly became popular. It was more subtle than that. She had become significant. She was the girl who had played the music, the girl who had silenced the teacher. In the lunchroom, a group of students waved her over to their table. For the first time, she didn't feel like an intruder. They didn't ask her about the music directly, but they included her in their conversation, treating her like one of them. It was a small thing, but it felt like a revolution. Her lessons with the teacher were just as transformative. The classroom after school was a different place. It was quiet, focused. He was patient, explaining the complex language of music with a passion she had never seen in him before. He was not just teaching her notes. He was giving her the tools to build her own castles of sound. He would listen to her play, his head cocked, a look of intense concentration on his face, and then he would offer a suggestion, a small adjustment that would unlock a whole new level of emotion in the piece. They were no longer just a teacher and a student. They were two musicians, learning from each other. Finally, the night of the winter showcase arrived. The auditorium was filled with parents and students, the air buzzing with excited chatter. Backstage, she felt a familiar flutter of nerves in her stomach, but it was different this time. It wasn't the paralyzing fear of being judged. It was the thrilling, electric energy of a performer about to share something they loved. She peeked through the curtain and saw the old upright piano in the corner of the stage, now joined by a sleek black grand piano waiting in the center. It was as if her two worlds were coming together. Then her name was called. She walked out onto the stage, the bright lights warm on her face. The chatter in the auditorium died down. She sat at the grand piano, her fingers finding their familiar home on the keys. She looked out at the sea of faces, and for a moment she felt a flicker of the old fear. But then her eyes found the wings of the stage where the teacher was standing. He looked at her and he gave her a small, slow nod. It was not a nod of command, but of respect. It was a gesture of trust and of apology. She smiled a genuine, confident smile and turned back to the piano. She closed her eyes, took a breath, and began to play. The music that filled the auditorium was the same fiery, passionate piece she had played in the classroom, but now it was stronger, clearer, more refined. It was the sound of a girl who had found her voice and was no longer afraid to use it. And as the final note faded into a perfect, awestruck silence, she knew that this was just the beginning.